After Star Wars was released, it became apparent that my story, however many films it took to tell, was only one of thousands that could be told about the characters who inhabited its galaxy. But these were not the stories that I was destined to tell. Instead, they would spring from the imagination of other writers, inspired by the glimpse of a galaxy that Star Wars provided. Today, it is an amazing, if unexpected, legacy of Star Wars that so many gifted writers are contributing new stories to that saga. George Lucas, from the introduction of A Splinters of the Mind's Eye, 1996. Welcome back to the Skywalker Files from a certain point of view. I'm Rockwell, and today we arrive at the moment where the expanded universe had to step aside and let the films reclaim center stage. We've covered political conspiracies, Sith lurking in the shadows, even a Jedi struggling with his rebellious teenage daughter. But now, the crawl is rolling again. After 16 years of waiting, George Lucas was about to unveil a brand new chapter of Star Wars. And naturally, someone had to write the novelization. Enter Terry Brooks, already a best-selling fantasy author, handpicked to adapt The Phantom Menace for readers. In 1999, Terry Brooks, yes, the author of The Sword of Shannara, was chosen to adapt George Lucas's brand new film, The Phantom Menace. Not just a transcription of the script, mind you, but a novelization with additions, expansions, and the occasional attempt at smoothing over the rough edges. Some might say Brooks' real task was less write a book and more keep the galaxy patient until May 19th. Over the course of this episode, we'll explore what Brooks brought to the story, the extra shading he gave certain characters, and how the novel fit into the vast tapestry of the expanded universe. We'll also reflect on the strange position this book holds, simultaneously a work of literature and a marketing herald, a bridge between eager fans and a film they hadn't seen yet. So settle in. There'll be pod racing, there'll be trade disputes, and somewhere in the middle of it all, there'll be a small boy from Tatooine with a rather large destiny. Terry Brooks' The Phantom Menace hit shelves on May 3rd, 1999, just over 2 weeks before the film itself premiered. In a pre-streaming, pre-spoiler warning world, this meant you could stroll into a bookstore, pick up a copy, and know the entire plot of Episode 1 before the lights even dimmed in the theater. For those who wanted to go in fresh, it was a dangerous temptation. For others, it was a perfect appetizer. And truth be told, for many fans, Brooks' prose would be the first taste they ever had of the prequel era. As for Brooks himself, he wasn't some obscure tie-in writer pulled from the Star Wars bullpen. By the late 90s, he was already a heavyweight in fantasy literature. His Shannara series had sold millions, and his name carried a kind of weight that suggested Lucasfilm wanted more than just a novelization. They wanted credibility. After all, if Terry Brooks was willing to step into George Lucas's sandbox, surely Star Wars was about to deliver something grand. In terms of timeline, The Phantom Menace is set 32 years before the Battle of Yavin, making it the earliest point in Star Wars chronology at the time of publication. Long before Luke stared wistfully at twin suns, before Han shot anyone in any order, and even before Palpatine perfected his sentient scowl, we had this. Jedi at the height of their power, the Republic still standing, mostly upright, and a galaxy that looked far more polished than the used universe we were used to. So, from a publishing perspective, this novel wasn't just another entry into the expanded universe. It was an anchor. The point where the old EU had to align itself with the new films. Everything written before would have to bend or break around it, and everything written after would live in its shadow. One of the real advantages of a novelization is access to what characters are thinking, what drives them, and what they can't quite say out loud. Now, in The Phantom Menace, Terry Brooks leans into that strength, giving us insights that sometimes line up with what we see on screen, and sometimes rescue characters who otherwise were flattened by dialogue and editing choices. Take, for example, Qui-Gon Jinn. In the film, Liam Neeson's gravitas does much of the heavy lifting. He's stoic, wise, and just rebellious enough to irritate the Jedi Council. In the novel, Brooks digs deeper into Qui-Gon's philosophy. We see his constant, deliberate choice to follow the living force rather than the bureaucracy's rules, and it makes his disagreements with the Council feel like the natural result of conviction rather than mild insubordination. He's less the grumpy uncle of the Jedi Order and more of a man with a clear, if inconvenient, sense of destiny. Obi-Wan Kenobi, meanwhile, gets more shading as well. On screen, Ewan McGregor was still settling into the role, and the film tends to make him appear, well, young, dutiful, and occasionally exasperated. The novel shows us that the exasperation from the inside, Obi-Wan wrestling with doubts about Qui-Gon's choices, his desire to be a model Jedi, and his very human struggle to reconcile both. It's a glimpse of a man who will one day carry an entire trilogy on his shoulders, rather than the apprentice mostly along for the ride. Then there's Padme Amidala, who in the film is often trapped behind makeup, costumes, and dialogue that insists on formality. Brooks uses prose to slip behind that mask. Literally. We get her perspective as a young woman carrying enormous responsibility, the strain of constantly maintaining a queenly facade, and even her quiet frustration at being underestimated. Where the movie shows us a regal figurehead, the novel reveals a teenager navigating a galactic crisis while pretending she's twice her age. Anakin Skywalker is perhaps where the greatest difference lies. On screen, Jake Lloyd's performance and the film script make him come across as precocious, a bit awkward, and occasionally bewildered. The novel, however, lets us linger inside his head. We see his instincts, his mechanical genius, and his deep yearning for freedom and connection. In Brooks' hands, Anakin feels less like a boy who said Yippee, and more like a child marked by potential and shadow. Even characters like Darth Maul, who in the film is more of a presence than a personality, benefit from Brooks' attention. The novel grants us glimpses into his training, his obedience to Sidious, and the cold efficiency that drives him. It's not much, but it's more than the 2 or 3 lines of dialogue he receives in the film. In short, the novel doesn't reinvent these characters, but it quietly reframes them. Where the film leans on spectacle and shorthand, the book lingers, showing us what's under the surface. And if nothing else, it's proof that the expanded universe, even characters bound by film canon, could find a little more room to breathe. The novel opens, as you'd expect, with politics, because nothing says Star Wars like a trade dispute. The Trade Federation has blockaded Naboo under the guidance of Darth Sidious, and two Jedi, Qui-Gon Jinn and Obi-Wan Kenobi, are sent as negotiators. In the film, this sequence plays briskly, with tension quickly boiling into action. In the novel, Brooks takes more time to establish the creeping dread, highlighting the Federation's fear of the Jedi and layering in the sense that Sidious's schemes are already tightening their grip on the galactic affairs. From there, the story unfolds along the same lines as in the film. The Jedi's escape, their landing on Naboo, their fateful encounter with Jar Jar Binks, and the eventual meeting with Queen Amidala. But here's where the book earns its keep. Brooks expands Amidala's point of view, letting us see the enormous pressure she's under as a young monarch. While the film often hides her behind the elaborate costumes and flat delivery, the novel shows her inner turmoil, her determination tempered by genuine fear. The escape to Tatooine brings us to the heart of the novel's tone, destiny colliding with circumstance. Anakin Skywalker enters the story not as a chosen one emerging from a cloud of prophecy, but as a gifted boy whose thoughts, dreams, and frustrations Brooks lays bare. We see his insensitive compassion for others, his sharp intelligence, and his yearning to rise above slavery. Where the film sometimes paints him as a wide-eyed and a touch clumsy, the book lingers on the currents of something larger flowing beneath the surface. The pod race becomes less about the spectacle and more about Anakin's ability to focus, endure, and succeed against impossible odds, a theme Brooks returns to again and again. Meanwhile, Qui-Gon emerges as a thematic counterweight, the man who insists on trusting the living Force, even when the Council and Obi-Wan doubt him. In the novel, his decision to bring Anakin along feels less like stubbornness and more like clarity, an unshakable belief that destiny has taken shape before his eyes. The tone here is one of inevitability, the sense that events are already being drawn towards something greater, even if the characters don't yet see it. Back on Coruscant, Brooks leans into the labyrinth of politics. We spend more time inside Amidala's perspective as she navigates the Senate, and the prose makes clear just how powerless she feels when procedure and bureaucracy fail to save her people. Here, the novel underscores a major theme, the corruption of the Republic. It's not subtle, but it's effective. The climax on Naboo plays out much as it does in the film. The Gungan alliance, the Starfighter assault, the duel with Darth Maul. Yet Brooks manages to inject a touch more weight into the proceedings. The Gungan's willingness to fight for Naboo feels like an earned alliance rather than a colorful sideshow. The space battle, though still secondary, benefits from internal perspectives that raise the tension. And the duel. Well, the duel feels every bit as operatic as John Williams' score made it sound, with Brooks giving us glimpses of Maul's predatory focus and Qui-Gon's steadfast resolve. Of course, the inevitable happens. Qui-Gon falls, Obi-Wan triumphs, and Anakin survives his first brush with destiny. The novel ends with the galaxy celebrating a victory that feels, at least to the reader, deeply hollow. Because Brooks never lets us forget, beneath the shining surface of parades and ceremonies, something darker is taking shape. In tone, the novelization often feels like it's working overtime to balance two halves: the optimism of adventure and the inevitability of tragedy. Themes of destiny, political decay, and generational conflict run throughout. wrapped in prose that try to elevate what the screenplay sometimes left undercooked. If the film played like a spectacle, the book reads more like a warning that even in times of light, shadows are already stretching across the galaxy. One of the most interesting things about Brooks' The Phantom Menace is the way it had to serve two masters. On one hand, it was chained to Lucas's screenplay, unable to deviate too far from the established beats. But on the other, it was still very much part of the expanded universe, an entire publishing line of novels and comics that had spent years building a tapestry of lore. Brooks threads the needle by filling gaps. The film gives us Darth Maul as a silent enigma with a double-bladed lightsaber. The novel sprinkles in glimpses of his training, his slavish devotion to Sidious. It doesn't suddenly make him Shakespearean, but it does make him more than a stuntman in face paint. Readers who had followed Maul's comic appearances, like Shadowhunter or Saboteur, could find continuity in character who was rapidly becoming a fan favorite, even with only a handful of lines to his name. The Jedi Council also benefit from the page treatment. In the film, there are largely a row of solemn faces. In the novel, Brooks gives us moments that highlight their political caution, their skepticism of Qui-Gon, and their deep discomfort with the prophecy. In doing so, he foreshadows their institutional steadfastness that will eventually lead to their downfall. Fans already familiar with the Jedi portrayed in earlier EU novels, characters like Joruus C'baoth or even Vergri, would recognize the through line of a Jedi Order that was increasingly detached from the living Force. Then there's the Republic. On film, the Senate sequences can feel like a sudden detour into civics class. On the page, Brooks underscores the rot within the system, the procedural dead ends, the hollow rhetoric, the way figures like Palpatine thrive in bureaucratic shadows. It ties neatly to James Locarno's Cloak of Deception, published 2 years later, which would expand on the corruption in a far greater detail. Together, they form a picture of a republic in terminal decline, years before the Clone Wars. Even the small details, the Gungan society, Naboo culture, the political chess match surrounding Amidala echo outward into the EU. Later stories would pick up these threads, giving Naboo and its people more depth than just the planet with the fancy waterfalls. In short, the novel doesn't just retell the Phantom Menace. It places the film firmly inside a galaxy already sprawling across shelves. It bridges the optimism of adventure with the cynicism of politics, laying the groundwork for stories that would pick up these threads for years. For fans reading in 1999, it wasn't the beginning of a new trilogy. It was the foundation for a whole new era in Star Wars storytelling. Terry Brooks' The Phantom Menace novelization occupies a curious place in Star Wars history. On one hand, it is forever tethered to the film itself, meaning it inherits both the excitement and the controversy that swirled around Episode 1. On the other, it has enough of Brooks' fingerprints to stand apart, offering readers insights and expansions that soften some of the rougher edges. At the time of release, the novel was a phenomenon in its own right. It sold briskly, driven by the sheer hunger for new Star Wars content after 16 long years of waiting. For many fans, it was the first real step into a prequel era, sometimes even read before they saw the film, meaning their first impression of Anakin, Qui-Gon, and Amidala came not from the big screen, but from Brooks' prose. That gave the book an outside influence, shaping expectations of who these characters were and what their world represented. In terms of legacy, the novel is remembered less as a literary triumph and more as a cultural milestone. It proved that Star Wars novelizations could be more than transcriptions, that with the right author, they could add shading, insight, and even a touch of gravitas. Brooks' reputation lent weight to the project, showing Lucasfilm was willing to treat the expanded universe not as a product, but as storytelling worthy of respected names in fantasy literature. Themes of destiny, corruption, and the slow decay of institutions run through the book, tying it neatly to the larger EU tapestry. Later novels like Cloak of Deception, Darth Maul Shadowhunter, and the Clone Wars material would build on these seeds, but it was Brooks who first planted them in the soil of the prequel era. Looking back now, the novel has a kind of nostalgic charm. It belongs to that heady moment in 1999 when Star Wars was suddenly everywhere again, when every book, comic, and toy felt like a piece of the future. Whether you view Episode 1 as a triumphant return, or, as well, something more complicated, the novelization captures that sense of promise. It is, in its own way, a time capsule. So the legacy of the Phantom Menace novelization is less about what it fixed or improved, and more about the moment it represents, the day Star Wars leapt back to the mainstream, not just on the screen, but on the page. And that brings us to the end of our journey through Terry Brooks' The Phantom Menace, a novel that stood at the intersection of cinema and publishing, shaping how millions of fans first experienced the prequel era. It may not have reinvented the galaxy, but it gave voice, nuance, and just enough depth to remind us that Star Wars was once again alive on the page. Next time on the Skywalker Files, from a certain point of view, we'll be shifting gears from the polished world of a major film novelization to the illustrated panels of Dark Horse Comics. Our focus will be Outlander, a story that takes us deep into the wilds of Tatooine with none other than Ki-Adi-Mundi at the center. It's a tale of Tusken Raiders, shifting alliances, and an uneasy dance between Jedi principles and desert survival. In other words, we'll see just how complicated life can get for a Cerealian Jedi when he's far from the marble halls of Coruscant. So until then, thank you for listening, and may the Force be with you always.